Welcome back to Let's Make a Game. I recently made a video called I Don't Know Why Games Do This, which was about something I'd noticed in a particular game, but it was something I'd noticed before as well, where you get the option to examine particular things about your surroundings, but the choice to examine them doesn't really affect the game. It just gives you a little bit of description of the environment or the setting. And I noticed this in a Twine game, and I had noticed it in other games in which you play a single character. And before that, I had noticed it in printed game books, although in printed game books it's more often in talking to friendly characters that this sort of form happens, where you have these choices. You can ask them about this, this or this, or you can examine this, this and this, but then examining it just gives you a bit of, I guess you could call it flavour text. It doesn't really have any good or bad consequences. And I thought that that was bad game design, because the thing that makes games interesting is seeing the results of your actions. And if there are no results, if you're just pushing buttons, you might as well be reading a book. The only way in which it's interactive is that you can choose which order to read this stuff in, and I suppose you could skip some, but I would imagine that most people who wanted to play the game would choose all of the options. I always chose all of the options. And I've received a comment, and I want to spend this video responding to the comment, because the comment didn't agree with me, but I don't really completely agree with the comment either. So let's go through it. I'll read it out. The common examine options in Twine games are not choices, and they are transparently not meant to be choices. Well, I agree that they're not choices. That was my complaint, I suppose. I don't agree that they're transparently not meant to be choices, because it isn't transparent to me. In game books that I've played, sometimes when you examine things, there are consequences. Sometimes that springs a trap, or sometimes you find an item. And so they are choices in the sense that they do affect the outcome of the game. But I'm prepared to accept that it might be transparent to the commenter, and I'm prepared to accept that it might be transparent to people who are more familiar with the conventions of games like this. But I'd suggest that that's probably a fairly small number of people, perhaps. And anyway, it's not transparent to me, is I guess my response. I don't know how to, I don't claim to be a typical gamer. I'm not a typical gamer. But, it is at least not transparent to me. Anyway, the comment goes on. The reason why they are done this way, and why this is good game design, is that it allows the author to build more depth in their world and narrative, while still keeping the main thread lean and quick. It gives players the opportunity to learn more, should they want to, but also makes it easy to skip the non-essentials and follow the main plot. Okay. The reason that I don't agree that they constitute a good game design is that I don't think you should separate showing the world you've made from the plot. In other words, the plot shouldn't come to a halt while... how can I put this? It shouldn't be, okay, here's some choices that are plot. Right, we're going to stop now because I want to tell you about the different languages in my world. Okay, you've learnt about the languages? Great. Now we can get on with the plot. To me, that is not good game design. What I think should happen is that you learn about the world given the nature of the choices that you're making, right? So, for example, in my game, the currency is cowrie shells, whereas the bog standard fantasy default assumption, I suppose, would be gold pieces. That suggests that the influences that have come to make my game world are a little bit beyond sort of conventional vanilla fantasy. But the point is, the game doesn't stop. I don't have you, for example, examining a merchant's house and you look at the ledger book and you realise, oh, it's all in cowrie shells. They use cowrie shells for currency here. That would be a way of doing it that I think would be bad game design, because it would be stopping the plot to go, right, let me tell you about my world. And I don't think that's what should happen. I think that the world building should be given to the player as part of the choices that they're making. And I actually think that a lot of the time, if you can't do that, maybe you shouldn't give it to the player, because I actually think that world building, right, this idea that we have to create a world with its languages and its history and etc., and that's the important part of fantasy. And it is particularly a disease of fantasy. I mean, you could probably find it in science fiction as well. You could probably find something similar in historical works, but it's not so much in that case. It's not so much showing you the world they've made, but showing you how much research they've done into the details of a particular time and place in the past. But I think that desire to show off the details of the fictional world you've constructed, as opposed to have a plot, have a story, makes a lot of novels bad and not written. I think a lot of people actually start to write a fantasy novel and they go, right, well, I've got to design my world, I've got to design my continent, I've got to draw a map, and they never get around to actually writing a story. And I think that's partly because people think that's how Tolkien did it. There's this common belief that Tolkien sat down and wrote his Elvish language, and then he invented a history, and then finally he sort of, once he'd done all that, he wrote a story on top of it. And that's not really true. If you look at The Hobbit, and remember that was the first thing that the first fiction that he got published. If you look at The Hobbit, there's no Rohan in it, there's no Mordor in it, there's no Gondor in it. There are elves, but they're basically entirely different to the elves of Lord of the Rings. There certainly are hobbits, and he certainly created a sort of fictional idea of what hobbits were like. But really, it isn't, apart from the hobbits, it really isn't the same world. It isn't the world of Lord of the Rings. And in fact, he had to, well, he didn't have to, but he chose to alter one of the chapters of The Hobbit because he changed his idea of what the ring was. Originally, it was a ring that made you invisible. And it became more and more sort of central and important to the story that he wanted to tell, and eventually he felt that it was incompatible with what was in The Hobbit, and so the version of The Hobbit that you will buy now, that particular chapter is quite different. Obviously, if he'd sat down and written his world beforehand, that wouldn't have been the case, because it would have been this consistent world that he'd followed through. Anyway, that's a slight side diversion, I suppose, that I think world building is world building in the absence of plot is generally a bad thing. And so this person's point, which is that it's a way, it allows the author to build more depth in their world, well, that's not a very good way of building more depth in your world. I mean, in the particular example that I complained about, it wasn't really world building details anyway. It was just a description of the environment. But let's sort of let's be generous and let's say that there was a false choice, a choice which didn't affect the game, and the game did tell you details about the world. And even let's say those details were quite interesting. I still don't think that's very good game design. What you're doing there is telling someone about the world you've made, and telling someone about the world you've made is not the same thing as creating a game for people to play. And I believe that world building should only happen as one of the detail, as part of what happens in the game, as part of meaningful choices made in the game, not as a side thing. So, in short, I don't agree with the point that this person made. I'm prepared to accept that I'm possibly not the target audience, and this particular game that I looked at was a very popular game, so obviously someone's playing it and enjoying it. And if this is a convention of such games, and this comment seems to be speaking as if this is a common thing that happens in these games, perhaps people who play these games enjoy them, and perhaps again there's something I'm missing. But I would have to say that I wasn't convinced, at the very least, by what this person said. But thanks for posting it. I mean, it's only computer games. Like hopefully we can disagree about computer games and not get too heated, because who cares, right? Ultimately. But anyway, I thought that was interesting, and this is my take on it as someone who's not part of the sort of core audience for these games, about what I think makes such a game good or not good. So I hope that was useful or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.